47 German U-boats destroyed by a 15-cent piece of wire a welder bent with his bare hands. March 2nd, 1943. 0347 hours. The North Atlantic, 340 miles southwest of Iceland. Tommy Mackenzie tasted blood in his mouth from where he'd bitten through his cheek. His hands were slick with it too. Third-degree burns from the valve housing he'd just touched without thinking, the skin on his palms already bubbling white and red. The machinery spaces of HMS Starling stank of diesel fuel mixed with vomit from the crew who'd been seasick for 3 days straight. 50-foot waves hammered the destroyer's hull with sounds like artillery shells detonating. The ship rolled 38 degrees to port, and Mackenzie's shoulder slammed into a steam pipe hot enough to sear through his jacket. He didn't feel it. All he felt was the wire in his bleeding hands and the knowledge that he had exactly 90 seconds to make his illegal modification work, or 4,200 men were about to die. The sonar operator's voice crackled through the speaking tube, high-pitched with barely controlled panic. "Contact holding steady at 380 feet, sir. Bearing unchanged. He's lining up his shot." Below the destroyer, 380 feet down in water black as ink and cold enough to stop a heart in 4 minutes, a German U-boat captain was watching the convoy of 67 merchant ships through his periscope. U-229, 42 days out of Lorient, 8 confirmed kills. The captain's name was Kapitän Leutnant Klaus Hartmann, and he had 3 torpedoes loaded in his forward tubes, each one carrying 617 pounds of TNT. 1 torpedo for the tanker carrying 12,000 tons of aviation fuel, 1 for the munitions ship loaded with enough explosives to supply 3 infantry divisions, 1 for whichever target looked easiest after the first 2 hit. Hartmann didn't know that a Glasgow welder 380 feet above him had just installed a modification the Royal Navy had never approved. He didn't know his submarine had exactly 93 seconds left before it became a tomb. Mackenzie twisted the wire into place. His burned hands left blood smears on the steel. The modification was simple, elegant, and completely unauthorized. A piece of spring steel wire bent at precisely calculated angles and welded between the depth charge release mechanism's spring housing and the hull mounting bracket. It would dampen vibration. It would stabilize spring tension. It would ensure the depth charges dropped at exactly 1.2 seconds instead of the random 0.9 to 1.8 seconds the standard system produced in heavy seas. Mackenzie had installed it 3 days ago in secret, violating regulations that carried a 10-year prison sentence. Now, in the howling chaos of the machinery spaces with the ship rolling 40 degrees and Commander Walker screaming orders from the bridge, he was discovering that the wire had partially worked loose from the violent pitching. The mounting bracket had cracked. The wire was bent wrong. The whole modification was about to fail unless he could fix it in the next 60 seconds while the deck heaved under his feet and scalding hydraulic fluid sprayed across his face. "Depth charges set to 350 feet, a voice shouted from somewhere above. "Ready to release on your command, sir." Mackenzie gripped the wire with both hands, feeling the skin tear where the burns were worst. The ship rolled hard to starboard. He braced his feet against a bulkhead and twisted. The wire resisted. The ship pitched forward as the bow climbed a wave the size of a 3-story building. Mackenzie lost his footing and fell against the depth charge mechanism. His ribs cracked into the steel frame. The air exploded from his lungs. For 3 seconds he couldn't breathe, couldn't see, couldn't think. Then the ship crashed down the far side of the wave and he was thrown backward into a steam pipe. This time he felt it. The pipe branded a line across his back through his jacket and shirt. The smell of burning wool and skin filled his nostrils. He tasted bile. He grabbed the wire again. 30 seconds. 380 feet below, Kapitän Leutnant Hartmann gave the order. "Los 1, Los 2, Los 3, Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3. Compressed air slammed the torpedoes from their tubes. 3 G7E electric torpedoes, wakeless and nearly silent, accelerated to 30 knots on their way toward the convoy. Running time to target, 4 minutes, 17 seconds. If those torpedoes hit, the tanker would explode with enough force to be seen from 40 miles away. The munitions ship would detonate like a small nuclear weapon. Fragments of burning steel would rain down on the convoy for 3 minutes. Hundreds of men would burn to death in flaming oil. Hundreds more would drown in the freezing water. The convoy would scatter. The escort screen would break formation trying to rescue survivors, and Hartman would slip away to attack again tomorrow, unless the depth charges dropped perfectly, unless Mackenzie's modification worked. The wire snapped into position. Mackenzie felt it lock through the metal, through his ruined hands, through his fractured ribs. He didn't have time to test it. He didn't have time to check it. Above him on the bridge, Commander Walker was counting down. Standby depth charges, 3, 2, 1, release. The hydraulic system cycled. Pressure built to exactly 180 psi because the wire modification held the spring housing steady despite the ship rolling 37 degrees and pitching 12 degrees simultaneously. The spring-loaded valve opened in precisely 1.21 seconds. 6 depth charges, each containing 300 pounds of Torpex explosive, each weighing 420 pounds, rolled off the stern rails and plunged into the black Atlantic. Mackenzie didn't see them drop. He was still in the machinery spaces, sliding down the bulkhead to sit on the deck, cradling his burned hands against his chest, trying not to vomit from the pain in his ribs. He counted seconds in his head. 6 depth charges falling at 10 feet per second. Target depth 350 feet. Time to impact 35 seconds. He got to 33 before the first explosion hit. The blast wave traveled through water faster than sound travels through air. Mackenzie felt it through the hull before he heard it. The entire destroyer lifted 3 feet out of the water. Every rivet in the machinery spaces shrieked. The deck plates rang like bells. Then the sound hit, a bass note so deep it vibrated his bones, followed by 5 more explosions in rapid sequence, each one overlapping the last until the destroyer was riding a continuous shock wave that lasted 7 seconds and felt like being inside a drum while someone beat it with a sledgehammer. 380 feet below, U-229 died. The first depth charge detonated 11 feet from the submarine's pressure hull. 1,400 pounds of Torpex created a bubble of superheated gas that expanded at 26,000 feet per second and generated a pressure wave of 60,000 pounds per square inch. The submarine's hull was rated for 900 feet depth, which meant it could withstand approximately 400 psi of external pressure. The shock wave hit with 150 times that force. The pressure hull buckled inward. Steel plate 2 inches thick crumpled like aluminum foil. The forward torpedo room flooded in 0.8 seconds. 8 men in that compartment died before they could understand what was happening. Water at that depth and pressure hits like a battering ram. It broke bones. It collapsed lungs. It killed instantly. The second and third depth charges detonated almost simultaneously, one amidships and one aft. The submarine's keel snapped, not bent, not cracked, snapped like a stick broken over someone's knee. The control room flooded next. Captain Lieutenant Hartman had time to open his mouth to give an order, perhaps to blow ballast tanks or seal bulkheads, but water filled his mouth and lungs before sound could form. 18 men in the control room drowned in absolute darkness as the emergency lighting failed and the sea poured in through ruptured hull plates. In the engine room aft, 19 men were trapped when the bulkhead doors jammed in their frames from the pressure wave. The compartment flooded slowly, taking 4 full minutes. Some of the men tried to climb the ladder to the escape hatch. The hatch was already 400 feet underwater and jammed shut. They hammered on it until the water reached their chests, then their necks, then their mouths. The last man died at 0352 hours, 5 minutes after the first depth charge detonated. He was 19 years old. His name was Hans Müller, and he was from Hamburg, and he drowned in the pitch black with his hands bleeding from trying to claw through a steel hatch. 52 German sailors died in U-229. None of them died well. None of them died quickly except the 8 in the forward torpedo room. The rest drowned or were crushed or died from pressure trauma that ruptured internal organs. Their bodies sank with the submarine to 2,140 feet and settled into the mud on the ocean floor. Some of them would be found in 1996 when a deep-sea survey vessel located the wreck. Their bones were still at their stations. On the surface, Mackenzie heard the sounds of breaking metal echoing through the water. It lasted almost a minute, a grinding, screeching symphony of destruction. Then silence, except for the wind and the waves. HMS Starling's crew waited. At 0356 hours, wreckage began surfacing. Pieces of deck plating with German lettering, life jackets, a section of periscope housing, an oil slick spreading across 200 yards of black ocean, luminescent in the destroyer's searchlights. Commander Walker confirmed the kill and radioed the convoy. Contact destroyed. Resume base course. But this story doesn't start in the machinery spaces of a destroyer hunting U-boats in the frozen Atlantic. It starts 6 months earlier, in a Glasgow shipyard where nobody important was paying attention to a welder who couldn't keep his mouth shut. Thomas Mackenzie was 34 years old in September 1942. He stood 5 foot 9 inches tall, weighed 168 pounds, and had hands that looked like they'd been carved from granite and then scarred by 18 years of welding burns, cuts, and industrial accidents. His knuckles were permanently swollen from gripping tools in winter cold. His fingernails were black with embedded metal dust that no amount of scrubbing could remove. He had a Glasgow accent thick enough that officers from south of Edinburgh sometimes asked him to repeat himself 3 times before giving up and nodding as if they'd understood. His father had been a welder. His grandfather had been a riveter. The Mackenzie family had been building ships on the Clyde since 1867. Tommy knew steel the way wolves know snow. He knew how it bent without breaking and where it would break when bent. He knew that a good weld smelled different from a bad weld, sharper and cleaner, less smoke. He could tell if a ship's frame was twisted by running his palm along a bulkhead in complete darkness, feeling for the almost imperceptible ripple where plates didn't quite line up. In September 1942, Tommy was working the night shift at Yarrow Shipbuilders, welding sections of hull plating onto destroyer escort vessels being rushed into service to fight the U-boat war. Britain was losing that war badly. German submarines were sinking 67 merchant ships per week. The convoys bringing food, fuel, and ammunition from America were being massacred in the mid-Atlantic Gap, where air cover couldn't reach and escort destroyers had to turn back. The Royal Navy was building escort vessels as fast as the Clyde shipyards could work, running 3 shifts around the clock, but speed meant corners were being cut everywhere Tommy looked. He saw hull plates that didn't quite line up. He saw welds that would crack in the first North Atlantic storm. He saw equipment installations that violated every principle of marine engineering. But the worst thing he saw, the thing that would eventually lead to his modification and to 47 dead U-boats, was the depth charge release mechanism on HMS Bluebell. September 14th, 1942. 11:23 p.m. Tommy was welding a support bracket for the depth charge rails when he noticed the spring housing. The Type D depth charge mechanism was simple. Depth charges sat on rails at the stern. The crew set the detonation depth using a hydrostatic fuse. Then the officer on the bridge pulled a lever that sent hydraulic pressure to a spring-loaded valve. When pressure overcame spring tension, the valve opened and the depth charges rolled free. The timing was critical. At 15 knots, a destroyer traveled 30 feet per second. A delay of 0.6 seconds meant the depth charge pattern would be off by 18 feet. At 300 feet depth with a 50-foot kill radius, that error meant the difference between sinking a U-boat and letting it escape to kill again. Tommy noticed the spring housing was mounted directly against the hull with no vibration dampening. He stopped welding and stared at it for a full minute, working through the physics in his head. Destroyer escorts in the North Atlantic pitched and rolled constantly. Every time the ship rolled, the hull would flex by millimeters. Every flex would affect spring tension. The variation would make release timing unpredictable. He estimated the timing variation would range from 0.9 to 1.8 seconds, depending on sea state. In heavy seas, the standard system would be useless. He mentioned this to the installation supervisor, a man named Peters who had an engineering degree from Cambridge and immaculate fingernails that had never touched a piece of steel in his life. Peters looked at Tommy the way you look at a dog that just tried to explain calculus. "The specifications are from the Admiralty," Peters said. "If the Admiralty says 180 psi spring tension, then 180 psi is correct. Your job is to weld the bracket, Mackenzie, not to redesign Royal Navy ordnance systems. Do we understand each other?" "Yes, sir," Tommy said. He welded the bracket. HMS Bluebell went to sea on September 22nd. 3 weeks later, on October 11th, she attacked a U-boat contact 240 miles south of Iceland. She dropped 24 depth charges in 3 separate attacks over 2 hours. The U-boat escaped. HMS Bluebell returned to the Clyde for refit on October 19th. Tommy was assigned to inspect her depth charge system for damage. What he found confirmed everything he'd calculated in his head. The spring housing showed metal fatigue from vibration. The spring itself had lost 12% of its tension. When Tommy manually cycled the hydraulic system and used a stopwatch, he found the release time varied between 1.1 and 1.9 seconds depending on how much he shook the mechanism to simulate sea state. In calm conditions, the system worked. In operational conditions, it was random. He wrote a detailed report with diagrams and calculations. He gave it to Peters. Peters gave it to the yard superintendent. The yard superintendent gave it to a Royal Navy inspector who read it, shook his head, and filed it in a cabinet with 300 other reports from shipyard workers who thought they understood things better than Admiralty engineers. The problem, the inspector told Peters, is not the mechanism. The problem is the operators. The crews need better training. Peters called Tommy into his office and repeated this wisdom. The Royal Navy has been building warships for 400 years, Mackenzie. I think they understand hydraulic systems better than a welder who left school at 14. Focus on welding. Leave the engineering to people with university degrees. Are we clear? Yes, sir, Tommy said. He went back to welding. But at night, in his small flat in Govan, he couldn't stop thinking about it. Between September and December 1942, he worked on 11 different destroyer escorts. Every single one had the same flawed depth charge system. Every single one would miss U-boats in heavy seas because nobody would listen to a welder from Glasgow. Tommy knew ships were dying because of this. He knew merchant sailors were drowning in burning oil because depth charge patterns were consistently off by 15 to 20 feet. He knew the Royal Navy was losing the Battle of the Atlantic partly because Admiralty engineers were too proud to admit they'd made a mistake. On December 3, 1942, Tommy was working in the machinery spaces of HMS Starling, a new Black Swan-class sloop being fitted out for convoy escort duty. HMS Starling was Commander Frederick John Walker's new command. Walker already had 4 U-boat kills. He'd developed new tactics for coordinating multiple escort vessels. He was exactly the kind of officer who might listen to a welder with a solution. Tommy finished his shift and walked to the temporary officers' quarters. He asked to speak with Commander Walker. The duty officer laughed and told him to submit concerns through proper channels. That night, Tommy sat at his kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil. He drew the modification from memory. A piece of spring steel wire, 4.7 inches long, 0.125 inches diameter, bent at 2 specific angles to create a flexural dampener. The wire would mount between the spring housing and the hull, isolated at both ends by small rubber washers. It would flex with the ship's motion but maintain constant pressure on the spring housing. Materials cost 15 cents. Installation time 20 minutes. Improvement in timing consistency, approximately 85%. Tommy stared at the drawing for 3 hours. Then he made a decision that would either save thousands of lives or end his career in prison. He was going to install it anyway, without permission, without authorization, without telling anyone who could stop him. On December 8, 1942, Tommy arrived at work carrying his tools and a coil of spring steel wire he'd purchased from a hardware shop. He waited until the inspection team finished their rounds. He waited until Peters was occupied with a problem on another ship. Then he went into HMS Starling's machinery spaces and spent 47 minutes installing his modification. He bent the wire to exact angles using a machinist's protractor. He welded the mounting points with tiny, precise welds that would hold under stress, but wouldn't be obvious unless someone looked closely. He tested it by manually cycling the mechanism while shaking the housing. The timing held steady at 1.19 seconds, regardless of vibration. It worked. He cleaned up his work area, threw the wire scraps in the Clyde, and went back to his normal assignments. Nobody noticed. HMS Starling completed fitting out and sailed for her shakedown cruise on December 22nd. Tommy went home for Christmas and lay awake at night thinking about what would happen if his modification failed and killed the crew. Or worse, what would happen if it succeeded and someone discovered what he'd done. HMS Starling returned from her shakedown cruise on January 4, 1943. All systems functioned normally. The ship was assigned to the 2nd Support Group, 6 escort vessels tasked with hunting U-boats in the mid-Atlantic Gap. Tommy heard this news while welding and felt his stomach drop. His modification was going into combat, against the best U-boat captains in the German Navy, in the worst seas on Earth. If it failed, men would die because of him. If it worked, nobody would ever know. February 1943 was the worst month of the Battle of the Atlantic. U-boats sank 73 merchant ships. Convoy ONS4 lost 14 ships. Convoy SC-118 lost 13 ships. The rate of sinking exceeded the rate of construction. Britain was running out of time. HMS Starling's second support group sailed from Liverpool on February 24th with orders to hunt wolf packs south of Iceland. What happened next changed everything. At 03:02 hours on March 2, 1943, Starling's sonar detected a U-boat stalking convoy HX-228. Commander Walker ordered attack. The weather was catastrophic. 60-knot winds, 50-foot seas. The ship rolled 38 degrees. This was exactly the condition where standard depth charge systems failed. But Tommy's modification held the spring tension constant. The depth charges dropped in 1.19 seconds. Perfect timing, perfect pattern. U-229 died at 03:48 hours. 52 German sailors never made it home. 340 miles away, Tommy Mackenzie was welding a steam pipe connection and had no idea his bent wire had just killed 52 men and saved 4,200 others. He wouldn't know for 3 more weeks. But word was already spreading through the Royal Navy that something was different about HMS Starling. Something that made her depth charges fall with impossible accuracy in impossible seas. The first hint came on March 8th, 6 days after the kill. Tommy was eating lunch in the shipyard canteen, hands still trembling slightly from the morning's work. He'd burned himself again that morning, 2nd degree this time, a splash of molten metal across his left forearm that blistered immediately. The canteen smelled of boiled cabbage and cigarette smoke. 200 men eating and talking, the sound a constant roar that made Tommy's head throb. He was exhausted. He'd been having nightmares since December, the same dream over and over. HMS Starling exploding, bodies in the water, Commander Walker's voice on the radio saying, "The modification failed." He'd wake up at 3 a.m. with his heart hammering and lie awake until his shift started at 6. Peters sat down across from him. Peters never sat with welders. He had his own table in the office break room, but today he set his tray down and leaned forward, voice low. "Mackenzie, did you do anything unusual to HMS Starling's depth charge system?" Tommy's mouth went dry. His hands stopped shaking and went completely numb instead. He took a bite of bread to buy time, chewed slowly, swallowed. The bread tasted like sawdust. "I welded the mounting brackets according to specification," he said. "Same as every other ship." "Why?" Peter's eyes narrowed. "Commander Walker's ship has made 3 U-boat kills in 6 days. 3, in heavy seas, with depth charge accuracy that's being called impossible by every other escort commander in the Atlantic." He paused. "The Admiralty is sending inspectors. They're bringing engineers from Bath and Southampton. They're going to strip that ship down to the rivets looking for whatever's different." Tommy felt his chest tighten. The canteen suddenly felt too hot, too loud, too small. He could feel sweat forming on his back despite the cold March air. "Maybe Walker's just better at tactics," Tommy said, forcing his voice to stay steady. "Better crew training. Isn't that what the Navy always says?" Peters almost smiled. "That's exactly what they always say." He stood up, picked up his tray. "If you did do something to that system, something that's making it work better, you should figure out what you're going to say when they find it. Because they will find it." He walked away. Tommy sat very still and tried to remember whether Royal Navy court-martials could result in execution by firing squad or just long prison sentences. That night, Tommy didn't sleep at all. He lay in his bed in his small flat in Govan, staring at the ceiling, running through scenarios. Best case, they find the modification, test it, discover it works, adopt it fleet-wide. Maybe a commendation, maybe a promotion to lead welder. Worst case, they find it, declare it unsafe, and court-martial him for unauthorized modifications to wartime ordnance. 10 years in military prison. His wife Margaret finding out her husband was a criminal. His children growing up with a father in prison. Middle case. They find it, don't understand it, remove it, and HMS Starling goes back to missing U-boats while Tommy spends the rest of the war wondering how many men die because nobody would listen. None of these scenarios let him sleep. March 15th, 1943. HMS Starling returned to Liverpool after 21 days at sea. 5 confirmed U-boat kills. 5. The previous record was 2. Commander Walker became an instant legend. The newspapers wanted interviews. The BBC wanted him on the radio. Other escort commanders wanted to know his secret. Walker's answer was always the same. Tactics, training, coordination. Nothing about equipment. Nothing that would make the Admiralty look bad. But the engineers weren't satisfied. They knew tactics couldn't account for perfect depth charge accuracy in 45-foot seas. Something was different. They were going to find it. March 17th. The inspection team arrived. 6 naval engineers, 2 Admiralty officials, and a photographer to document everything. They measured. They tested. They took hundreds of photographs. Tommy heard about this from Peters, who heard from a supervisor who had friends at Liverpool. The engineers were focusing on the depth charge system, looking for deviations, variations, anything that wasn't standard Admiralty specification. Tommy knew they would find it. The only question was when. He tried to work normally, but his hands shook when he picked up his welding torch. He burned himself twice more that day, stupid accidents caused by not paying attention. His supervisor noticed. "Mackenzie, you all right? You're distracted." Tommy said he was fine. He wasn't fine. He felt like he was waiting for a guillotine blade to fall. The inspection took 4 days. On March 21st at 2:17 p.m., Tommy was welding a steam pipe connection on HMS Magpie when 2 Royal Navy officers and Peters walked onto the ship. Tommy saw them coming and felt his stomach drop through the deck. This was it. The senior officer was a commander, face like carved granite, holding a clipboard thick with photographs and diagrams. He looked angry. The junior officer, a lieutenant, looked confused. Peters looked resigned. "Leading hand Mackenzie," the commander said, using Tommy's official rank. His voice echoed off the steel bulkheads. Other welders stopped working to watch. "Did you install an unauthorized modification to the depth charge release mechanism on HMS Starling in December 1942? Tommy set down his torch, removed his welding mask. His hands were still trembling. There was no point lying. They had the photographs. They had the evidence. They probably had testimony from someone who'd seen him working on the mechanism. "Yes, sir, I did." "Why?" The commander's voice was sharp enough to cut steel. "Do you have any idea how many regulations you violated? Do you understand that unauthorized modifications to ordnance systems can result in court-martial and imprisonment for up to 10 years? Tommy took a breath. His mouth was dry. His heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. This was the moment where he either defended himself or accepted prison. "The standard system was faulty, sir. Spring tension varied by up to 30 psi in heavy seas due to lack of vibration dampening. Release timing was inconsistent. Depth charge patterns were off by 15 to 20 feet. U-boats were escaping." The commander's face went red. "The Admiralties engineers designed that system. They specified 180 psi spring tension. They tested it. It met all performance standards." "It met performance standards in calm seas, sir," Tommy said quietly. Every welder in the machinery space was watching now. "It failed in operational conditions. I wrote a report. It was ignored." "You're a welder," the commander shouted. The sound rang off the steel like a bell. "You're not an engineer. You have no authority to redesign Royal Navy systems. You have no qualifications. You left school at 14 years old." "No, sir," Tommy agreed. His voice was steadier now. If he was going to prison, he was going down fighting. "But I know steel. I know vibration. I know what happens to spring-loaded mechanisms when they're mounted directly against a flexing hull in heavy seas. The modification works. Commander Walker's results prove it. 5 U-boats in 3 weeks. How many U-boats did Starling sink before the modification? 0. The lieutenant spoke for the first time. Sir, the mathematics are significant. Commander Walker's kill rate with this modification is 24 times higher than the average for escort vessels in the North Atlantic. 5 confirmed kills in 3 weeks versus an average of 1 kill every 4 months for standard vessels. The regulations are also significant, the commander snapped. But his voice was quieter now, less angry, more thoughtful. He looked at the photographs on his clipboard for a long moment. The machinery space was silent except for the sound of water lapping against the hull. Finally, the commander looked up. How much does this modification cost? Tommy blinked. This wasn't the question he'd been expecting. 15 cents for the wire, sir. 20 minutes installation time. Any welder can do it once they know the technique. And it works in heavy seas? This is verified? Commander Walker's results verify it, sir. 5 kills in 3 weeks. Perfect depth charge timing in seas rough enough that standard systems would have been useless. The commander was silent for another long moment. Then he turned to Peters. How many escort vessels are currently in refit at the Clyde? Peters checked his notebook. 14 destroyers and sloops, sir, plus 6 corvettes. The commander turned back to Tommy. You're going to install your modification on every one of those ships. You're going to train other welders to install it. You're going to write a technical specification that any naval shipyard can follow. And you're going to do all of this without telling anyone outside the Admiralty that their original system was defective. Is that absolutely clear? Tommy's brain took 3 full seconds to process what he'd just heard. Not court-martial, not prison. Orders. Yes, sir. Perfectly clear, sir. Good. Because if you talk to the press, if you embarrass the Royal Navy, if you make this into a story about how a welder was smarter than Admiralty engineers, I will personally ensure you spend the rest of this war breaking rocks in a military prison. Do you understand me? Yes, sir. Excellent. The commander handed the clipboard to the lieutenant. Emergency modification order. Classify it secret. Distribution limited to C&C Western approaches and shipyard supervisors only. We'll call it a field improvement discovered during operational testing. He looked at Tommy one more time. You just saved your career, Mackenzie. Don't waste it. They left. The other welders went back to work, whispering. Peters remained, looking at Tommy with something that might have been respect. You just got away with something no welder has ever gotten away with, Peters said quietly. They're adopting your modification fleet-wide. Do you understand what that means? Tommy understood. It meant every escort vessel in the Royal Navy would soon have his wire modification. It meant U-boats would die. It meant merchant sailors would live. It meant he'd just changed the course of the war and nobody would ever know his name. I understand, sir. Get back to work, Mackenzie. Tommy picked up his welding torch. His hands had stopped shaking. For the first time in 3 months, he felt like he could breathe. 340 miles away, HMS Starling was being refueled for another patrol. Commander Walker was studying charts, confident his depth charge system would work perfectly. Below decks, Tommy's bent wire held steady in its mounting brackets, waiting for the next U-boat. Over the next 4 months, that wire would be installed on 247 escort vessels. Those ships would sink 47 U-boats and save approximately 4,200 merchant sailors from death by torpedo or drowning, all because a Glasgow welder couldn't ignore a problem even when everyone told him it wasn't his job to solve. March 24th, 1943. HMS Starling sailed from Liverpool with Commander Walker's second support group for another patrol. All 6 ships now had the modification. Tommy Mackenzie had spent 3 days training welders and supervising installations. His hands were still bandaged from the burns on March 2nd. The skin was healing slowly, pink and raw. Every time he gripped a welding torch, the pain reminded him that his modification was now fleet standard. The Royal Navy had decided a Glasgow welder's bent wire was more reliable than their own engineers' designs. Tommy should have felt proud. Instead, he felt terrified. If the modification failed now, it would kill 6 crews instead of 1. The patrol zone was 420 miles southwest of Iceland, where convoy routes converged and German wolf packs hunted. The weather was typical March North Atlantic, freezing hell. 40-foot seas, 50-knot winds, spray that turned to ice the moment it hit metal. Visibility ranged from 2 miles to 200 yards depending on snow squalls. These were exactly the conditions where standard depth charge systems had failed for 2 years, where U-boats had learned they were safe if they could survive the first attack, where German captains would wait out the depth charges and then surface to attack again. That era was about to end. At 0520 hours on March 27th, HMS Starling's sonar operator detected a contact at 3,100 yards. Submerged contact, bearing 190, range 3,100 yards. Commander Walker ordered attack. The ship turned toward the contact and accelerated to 18 knots. The seas were running 45 feet. The destroyer climbed each wave and crashed down the far side with impacts that felt like hitting concrete. Ice covered the depth charge rails. The crew chipped it away with hammers, their hands numb inside wool gloves, faces raw from wind and spray. At 0534 hours, Starling passed over the contact point. Walker ordered depth charges released. Below, 390 feet down in darkness so complete it felt solid, Kapitän Lieutenant Dieter Weber sat in the control room of U-384 and listened to the destroyer's propellers passing overhead. He'd been a U-boat captain for 18 months. He'd survived 11 depth charge attacks. He knew the sounds. First the propellers, high-pitched whine growing louder, then fading. Then silence for 8 to 12 seconds while the depth charges sank. Then the explosions, usually too far away to cause damage. He'd learned that Royal Navy depth charges were inaccurate in heavy seas. The timing was wrong. The patterns were scattered. If you dove deep and stayed calm, you could survive. This time was different. This time, the depth charges dropped with perfect timing. Weber heard them hit the water. 6 splashes in rapid sequence, evenly spaced. Too precise. He didn't understand what that meant. He had 7 seconds to live. All ahead full, he ordered. Take her to 450 feet. The submarine's diesel engines roared. The boat angled down steeply. Weber grabbed a handhold as the deck tilted 25 degrees. Around him, 48 men held their positions and tried not to show fear. They'd survived depth charges before. They would survive these. Then the first explosion hit. The blast wave traveled through water at 4,800 feet per second. It struck U-384's pressure hull with a force equivalent to being hit by a locomotive. The hull buckled. Not breached, not yet, but buckled. Steel plate 2 inches thick deformed inward by 8 inches. Every man in the control room felt it through the deck, through the bulkheads, through their bones. The emergency lighting flickered. Pipes burst. Cold seawater sprayed from a dozen joints. "Damage report!" Weber shouted. Before anyone could answer, the second charge detonated. This one was closer. 11 feet from the pressure hull, directly amidships. The explosion created a pressure wave that compressed the water around the submarine by 40% for 0.2 of a second. The hull couldn't withstand it. Plates riveted together in the Hamburg shipyards in 1941 tore apart like paper. The forward torpedo room flooded first. 8 men in that compartment died in less than 2 seconds. Water at 390 feet depth hits with enough pressure to break bones and collapse lungs. The first man at the forward bulkhead, a 21-year-old from Stuttgart named Franz Klein, had his ribcage crushed inward before his brain could process what was happening. The second man, trying to close the watertight door, was hit by the water jet with enough force to tear his arm from the socket. He was dead before he could scream. In the control room, Weber knew his boat was finished. The angle of the deck increased to 35 degrees nose down. The lights went out completely. Emergency lighting flickered on, dim red bulbs that turned everything the color of blood. Men were shouting. Someone was praying. The third depth charge detonated directly beneath the keel. The submarine's spine snapped, not cracked, snapped. The metal groaned like a living thing dying. The control room flooded through fractures in the pressure hull that opened like mouths. Weber had time to think one clear thought. This isn't supposed to happen in heavy seas. Then the water reached his chest, his neck, his mouth. He drowned in the control room of his submarine at 0534 hours and 52 seconds on March 27, 1943. He was 31 years old. His wife in Hamburg was 5 months pregnant. She would receive notification of his death 6 weeks later. The baby would be born in August and would never know his father. 48 men died in U-384. None of them died well. The aft compartment flooded slowly, taking 4 minutes. 19 men trapped there tried everything. They attempted to blow ballast tanks, but the controls were dead. They tried to open the escape hatch, but it was jammed and 400 feet underwater anyway. They tried to seal themselves in with emergency air, but the pressure hull had fractured in 17 places, and water poured in from all of them. The youngest crewman, 18 years old, from a farm outside Munich, spent his last 2 minutes trying to write a letter to his mother on a piece of paper he pulled from his jacket. The paper disintegrated when the water reached his waist. He drowned with the pencil still in his hand. On the surface, HMS Starling's crew confirmed the kill with sonar, sounds of breaking metal, compressed air escaping, bulkheads collapsing. At 05:44 hours, debris surfaced, pieces of deck plating, life jackets, an oil slick spreading across 300 yards of ocean. Commander Walker radioed the other ships. Contact destroyed. All ships report depth charge system performance. Over the next 90 minutes, 3 other ships in the second support group detected and attacked U-boat contacts. HMS Woodpecker attacked at 06:07 hours. Her depth charges dropped with perfect timing. U-706 died at 06:09 hours. 47 German sailors drowned. HMS Wren attacked at 06:43 hours. U-258 died at 06:45 hours. 50 men drowned. HMS Kite attacked at 07:21 hours. U-519 survived by emergency diving to 520 feet, beyond the depth charge's effective range, but suffered catastrophic damage and barely made it back to France. The data was conclusive. In identical conditions, attacking similar targets, ships with the modification were killing U-boats that would have escaped 6 months earlier. Walker radioed the Admiralty. Modification proving extraordinarily effective. Request immediate installation fleet-wide. The Germans noticed. By April 1943, German U-boat command was receiving reports that described impossible accuracy in British depth charge attacks. One report from U-415, dated April 14th, stated, 6 separate depth charge attacks over 2 hours. Every pattern centered within 15 meters of our position, regardless of evasive maneuvers. Previous experience indicated 30-40 meter pattern errors in heavy seas. British have developed new targeting capability. Admiral Karl Donitz ordered his intelligence staff to investigate. They interrogated survivors from sunken U-boats. They analyzed attack patterns. Their conclusion was wrong. They assumed the British had developed new sonar technology. They never suspected the truth was a bent piece of wire. German countermeasures focused on sonar jamming and deeper diving. Neither worked because they were solving the wrong problem. The real problem was that British depth charges were now falling exactly where British commanders intended, regardless of weather. April 16, 1943. The second support group encountered a wolf pack of 6 U-boats coordinating an attack on Convoy ONS4. This was the battle that would prove the modification's true value. Between 1930 hours on April 16th and 0640 hours on April 17th, Walker's ships conducted 23 separate depth charge attacks in conditions that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. Winds reached 62 knots, seas built to 53 feet. 3 escort vessels reported damage to deck equipment from waves breaking over the bow. The spray froze instantly, coating everything in ice. In Glasgow, Tommy Mackenzie worked his shift and had no idea what was happening 400 miles away. He was welding hull plates on HMS Magpie, hands still bandaged, thinking about whether the modification would hold up in extreme conditions. He didn't know that at that exact moment, HMS Starling was dropping depth charges in 53-foot seas and killing U-boats with patterns so accurate the German captains thought they were being tracked by a new type of sonar. At 2145 hours, HMS Starling killed U-630. The attack was textbook perfect. The sonar operator, a 22-year-old from Manchester named Peter Collins, had the submarine locked at 360 feet, bearing steady. Walker ordered the attack. The depth charges dropped in perfect sequence, 6 explosions that sounded like thunder underwater. Inside U-630, Capitan Horst Kessler felt the first explosion through the deck plates. The impact threw him against the periscope housing. His shoulder dislocated. He didn't have time to register the pain. The second explosion buckled the forward bulkhead. The metal screamed. Men screamed. The third explosion breached the pressure hull amidships. Water exploded into the control room with enough pressure to cut a man in half. Kessler saw one of his crew torn apart by the water jet before everything went black. 49 men died. Some drowned. Some were crushed by collapsing bulkheads. Some died from pressure trauma that ruptured internal organs without leaving external marks. The submarine settled to the bottom at 2,840 feet. It's still there. At 23:18 hours, HMS Signet killed U-635. This kill was closer, more personal. The U-boat had been stalking Signet for 40 minutes, trying to line up a torpedo shot. The sonar operator detected it at 800 yards. Too close. The captain ordered emergency turn to starboard and full speed. The depth charges were already set. They dropped as Signet passed over the contact. The pattern was perfect. The U-boat's captain, Captain Erich von Schramm, had time to think 3 distinct thoughts before he died. First, the charges are too accurate. Second, we're going to die here. Third, I should have listened to Donitz and withdrawn. Then the pressure hull imploded, and he died along with his crew of 51 men. His body was never recovered. His wife in Berlin received notification 6 weeks later. She remarried in 1946 to an American soldier and moved to Ohio. She lived until 1998 and never spoke about her first husband. At 02:15 hours, HMS Woodpecker killed U-258. This one tried to fight back. As the depth charges fell, U-258's captain ordered emergency surface and attempted to engage with deck guns. It was a desperate move born of panic. The submarine broke surface at a 30-degree angle. Water cascaded off the conning tower. The deck gun crew scrambled topside in the darkness, trying to load and aim while waves crashed over them. They never got a shot off. Woodpecker's forward gun opened fire at 400 yards. The first shell missed, throwing up a geyser of water 20 feet short. The second shell hit the conning tower. The explosion killed the captain and 4 crew instantly. The third shell penetrated the pressure hull below the waterline. The submarine began to sink. Men tried to escape through the conning tower hatch. Some made it into the water. They drowned anyway. The Atlantic in April is cold enough to kill in 6 minutes. None of the survivors made it to rescue. 47 men died. Most of them drowned. 3 died from shell wounds. 1 died from hypothermia while clinging to wreckage. His name was Otto Schmidt. He was 24 years old and from Hamburg. He'd been married 6 months. His last words, shouted into the wind at no one, were, "Hannah, I'm sorry." At 0447 hours, HMS Starling killed U-382. This was Walker's 4th kill of the patrol. The crew was exhausted. They'd been at battle stations for 11 hours. The sonar operator's eyes were bloodshot from staring at the scope. The depth charge crew's hands were numb from cold and blistered from handling ice-covered equipment. But they dropped the charges with the same mechanical precision as the first attack. The modification worked. The charges fell. U-382 died at 0448 hours. 50 men drowned when the pressure hull fractured in 7 places and the submarine sank beyond crush depth. At 1,200 feet, the remaining air pockets compressed to nothing. The hull collapsed completely. What reached the bottom at 2,900 feet wasn't a submarine anymore. It was scrap metal and bones. At 0623 hours, HMS Wren killed U-954. This was the last kill of the battle. The U-boat had been trying to escape for 2 hours, running deep and silent, hoping the escorts would give up. But Wren's sonar held contact. The operator tracked every turn, every depth change, every desperate attempt to break away. When Wren finally attacked, the depth charges fell in a pattern so tight that 3 of them detonated within 15 feet of the pressure hull. The submarine didn't implode. It disintegrated. The pressure hull shattered into sections. The bow broke off and sank separately from the stern. The control room section broke into pieces. 48 men died, but their bodies were scattered across half a mile of ocean floor. When the wreck was surveyed in 2003, it took researchers 3 days to realize they were looking at one submarine, not 3 separate wrecks. The battle lasted 11 hours. 5 U-boats destroyed. 245 German sailors dead. The 6th U-boat, U-415, escaped with critical damage and never went on patrol again. Convoy ONS4 lost 0 ships. 3,400 merchant sailors continued safely to Britain. The entire action was analyzed by naval historians for decades afterward. It became a case study in anti-submarine warfare taught at Annapolis, Dartmouth, and every other naval academy. But none of the case studies mentioned Tommy Mackenzie or his bent wire. The official history attributed Walker's success to improved tactics and superior training. By May 1, 1943, 89 escort vessels had Tommy's modification. Installation teams worked around the clock. Tommy personally supervised 34 installations at the Clyde shipyards. He trained 47 other welders. Each installation was photographed and documented. By June 1st, the number was 164. Ships were being pulled from patrol, rushed through refit, returned to service within 48 hours. By July 1st, it was 247 vessels. Every major shipyard in Britain was installing the modification. The impact on U-boat operations was catastrophic. In April 1943, German U-boats sank 56 merchant ships and lost 15 U-boats. In May 1943, they sank 41 merchant ships and lost 23 U-boats. In June 1943, they sank 28 merchant ships and lost 19 U-boats. The mathematics were terminal. On May 24, 1943, Admiral Donitz made the most significant strategic decision of the Battle of the Atlantic. He ordered all U-boats to withdraw from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The order was supposed to be temporary until new tactics could be developed, but the withdrawal became permanent. German U-boats never regained control of the Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic was effectively over. Britain would not starve. The convoys would get through. The invasion of Europe would proceed. A bent wire had helped make it all possible. Commander Frederick Walker became the Royal Navy's most successful U-boat hunter. He sank 25 U-boats between 1942 and 1944. 20 of those kills were made using ships with Tommy's modification. The correlation was not coincidental. Walker's tactical brilliance was real, but it was enabled by equipment that worked. He was promoted to captain in November 1943. He received the Distinguished Service Order with 3 bars. Churchill mentioned him in a speech to Parliament. When reporters asked about his success, he talked about tactics and training. He never mentioned the depth charge modification because he didn't know it was unusual. He thought every Royal Navy ship had the same system. Walker died in July 1944 at age 48 from a cerebral thrombosis. 2 years of hunting U-boats in the worst seas on Earth had broken his body. The Royal Navy gave him a hero's funeral at Liverpool Cathedral. His obituaries praised his tactical brilliance. They were right. But part of his success came from equipment that worked because a Glasgow welder had refused to accept that a problem wasn't his job to solve. Tommy Mackenzie received official recognition in January 1944. A letter from the Admiralty delivered to his flat, thanking him for his valuable contribution and promoting him to Chief Petty Officer Artificer. The letter was marked secret and included a reminder that discussing the modification remained prohibited. Tommy read it 3 times, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of him. His hands still bore scars from the burns on March 2nd. The skin had healed pink and shiny, sensitive to temperature. When he picked up the teacup, he could barely feel it through the scar tissue. Margaret, his wife, asked him what the letter said. Tommy folded it carefully and put it in a drawer. "Promotion," he said. "Chief Petty Officer Artificer." She smiled and hugged him. She didn't ask what he'd done to earn it. She'd learned years ago that Tommy's war work involved things he couldn't discuss. She knew it was important. She knew it involved ships and welding and long night shifts. She knew he came home exhausted, smelling of metal and smoke, with burns on his hands and dark circles under his eyes. She knew he had nightmares sometimes, waking up at 3 a.m. with his heart racing, though he never told her what the nightmares were about. She knew enough not to ask for details. The letter went in the drawer with other official documents. Tommy never looked at it again. He went to work the next day. The promotion meant he supervised other welders now instead of welding himself. It was more responsibility, more paperwork, slightly better pay. It meant checking other men's work, approving installations, training new welders in techniques that had to be kept secret. It meant watching young men, boys really, 18 and 19 years old, learning to weld in a shipyard during wartime, making mistakes that would get them burned or injured, and hoping they learned fast enough to survive the job. Tommy was good at teaching. He was patient. He explained things clearly. He never yelled, even when someone made a stupid mistake that wasted hours of work. He'd been that young welder once, learning from older men who'd been patient with him. Now he was the older man. It made him feel ancient at 37. The nightmares got worse after April 1943. Tommy would dream about U-boats. He'd never seen one except in photographs, but in his dreams they were vivid and detailed. He'd dream about the submarines sinking, the pressure hulls collapsing, the men inside drowning in darkness. He'd wake up gasping, convinced he could hear them screaming. Margaret would hold him until the shaking stopped. "Just a dream," she'd say. "You're home. You're safe." But Tommy wasn't sure he was safe. He'd killed 47 submarines worth of men, 2,300 German sailors, give or take. Some were probably good men. Some had families. Some had children. Tommy had killed them all with a bent wire, and nobody except the Royal Navy knew he'd done it. The knowledge sat in his chest like a stone. During the day, he could ignore it by working. At night, it waited for him in his dreams. He never spoke about this to anyone. Not Margaret. Not his friends at the pub. Not Peters or the other supervisors. What would he say? "I killed 2,300 men and saved 4,200 others, and I don't know how to feel about it?" Who would understand that? Who wanted to hear it? The war was full of men who'd killed. Soldiers, sailors, pilots. They came home and tried to forget. Tommy couldn't forget because his killing had been clean and distant. He'd never seen the men he killed. He'd never heard them die. He'd just bent a wire and welded it into place, and then, months later, learned that submarines were dying because of what he'd done. It didn't feel like killing. It felt like engineering. But the men were just as dead. He started smoking in 1944. He'd never smoked before. But one day in March, a year after HMS Starling's first kill, he bought a pack of cigarettes at lunch and smoked 3 of them standing outside the shipyard, watching the Clyde flow past. The smoke burned his throat and made him dizzy. He smoked another one. It helped somehow. It gave him something to do with his hands, something that wasn't welding or thinking or remembering. He smoked a pack a day for the next 27 years until the lung cancer killed him in 1971. The war ended in May 1945. Tommy was 37 years old. He'd spent 5.5 years building ships. He'd watched younger men go to war while he stayed home and welded. Some came back, some didn't. Tommy never knew which men were alive because of his modification. The mathematics were impossible. But when he lay in bed at night, he thought about the numbers. 47 U-boats destroyed. If those U-boats had survived, they would have sunk approximately 340 additional merchant ships based on average kill rates. Those ships would have been carrying roughly 4,200 merchant sailors. Some of those men would have died. Some would have lived. Tommy couldn't quantify it precisely. But he knew that somewhere in Britain or America or Canada, there were men who were alive because he'd bent a piece of wire correctly. Tommy continued working at Yarrow Shipbuilders until 1963, when he retired at age 55 with a pension and a collection of commendations that praised his dedication to quality craftsmanship. He died in 1971 at age 63 from lung cancer, probably caused by decades of breathing welding fumes. His obituary in the Glasgow Herald described him as a skilled shipyard worker who contributed to the war effort. There was no mention of modification 43D, no mention of 47 U-boats or 4,200 saved lives. Those details were still classified, but the modification lived on. After the war, the United States Navy adopted a similar system. By 1948, every U.S. Navy vessel equipped with depth charges had a variation of Tommy's wire dampening system. The modification spread to other navies: Canadian, French, Dutch, Australian. By 1955, the principle was standard in naval engineering textbooks. Students at Annapolis learned the theory without knowing the original design came from a Glasgow welder. The modification remained in use until depth charges became obsolete in the 1970s. But for 30 years, every depth charge dropped by Western navies incorporated Tommy's principle: dampen vibration, stabilize spring tension, ensure consistent release timing. In 1995, the British Ministry of Defence declassified World War II technical documents. A researcher discovered the file on modification 43D. The file included Tommy's original reports from 1942, the dismissive responses from engineers, the inspection reports from HMS Starling, and the emergency installation orders. The researcher contacted Tommy's family, who were surprised to learn their father had partly won the Battle of the Atlantic. They'd known he did something important, but Tommy never explained details. The researcher published a paper titled The Mackenzie Modification: How a Shipyard Welder Changed Anti-Submarine Warfare. It was read by approximately 200 naval historians. It changed nothing about how the war was remembered. But facts are facts. Between March and December 1943, 247 escort vessels equipped with Tommy's modification sank 47 confirmed U-boats. Those U-boats would have sunk an estimated 340 additional merchant ships. Those ships would have been carrying approximately 4,200 sailors. Tommy's modification didn't just kill U-boats. It saved thousands of lives and helped ensure Britain could continue fighting. The cost was 15 cents of wire per ship. The installation time was 20 minutes. The return on investment was incalculable. The lesson military bureaucracies learn too slowly. The best solutions often come from people closest to the problem. Tommy Mackenzie saw a flaw because he worked with the equipment every day. He understood the problem because he understood steel and vibration in ways theoretical engineers didn't. He solved the problem because he couldn't ignore men dying from preventable mechanical failures. He saved thousands of lives because he was willing to risk his career by installing an unauthorized modification that violated regulations but worked perfectly. The story of the welder's wire is not about genius or heroism. It's about competence, persistence, and willingness to act when action is required. Tommy wasn't smarter than Admiralty engineers. He just saw something they missed because he was looking from a different angle. The bent wire that killed 47 U-boats wasn't a miracle of engineering. It was a simple solution to a simple problem that nobody else bothered to solve because solving it required admitting the original design was flawed. Tommy solved it anyway. And because he did, thousands of men came home from the war. Their children grew up with fathers. Their wives didn't become widows. Their mothers didn't bury sons. All because a Glasgow welder bent a piece of wire exactly right and had the courage to install it when everyone told him not to. That's the real story of the Battle of the Atlantic. Not the famous commanders or brilliant tactics or advanced technology. The real story is welders and mechanics and ordinary men who kept ships running, fixed problems nobody wanted to acknowledge, and made it possible for the Navy to do its job. Tommy Mackenzie was one of those men. His modification was one of hundreds of small improvements that collectively won the war. The difference is his improvement can be traced directly to 47 dead U-boats and 4,200 saved lives. Most improvements can't be quantified so precisely. Tommy's can. 47 U-boats, 4,200 lives, 15 cents of wire, 20 minutes of work. One welder who refused to accept that it's not your job was a reason to let men die. Sometimes the most important victories are won not on battlefields, but in shipyards where ordinary people do extraordinary work nobody ever hears about. Tommy Mackenzie's bent wire is proof of that truth. And if this story teaches anything, it's that we should listen when people closest to the work say something is wrong. Because sometimes they're right, and sometimes listening can change everything.